Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill, busting myths, taking names. And, we try to do shows that are topical, but it's very, very hard to do a show when things are changing so quickly in the political world, the United States especially. But we're going to do one now on presidential primaries and presidential conventions. And the reason we're doing one now on presidential primaries and presidential conventions is because one of my colleagues, whose office is just down the hall, Carl Seiler, said, hey, what is this thing about primaries and conventions? How did those things develop? When did the conventions become just sort of showcases and things like that? And we've touched on this a little bit before in previous episodes on other things, but fortunately for all of you, we have your favorite buzzkiller, the absolute best buzzkiller, Dr. Philip Nash, on the line, who's going to take us through this. Professor, you're there, right?
I am here, absolutely.
And you're not
back and older than ever.
You're not like me. You're not going to go to Chicago,
no,
for the Democratic National Primary. But we're recording this on Tuesday the 23rd, and it's going to come out on Thursday the 25th. But we can't promise you that nothing else will happen in between those 2 days because
history's happening all the time.
It's been remarkable for what. What's going on has been remarkable and happening so quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, presidential nomination history, fascinating topic. But really, first, we should ask ourselves, is there a big picture here?
Right. Do I have a thesis to my comments here, brief as they are? I would say yes.
Well, but it's more than just the technical aspects of how this stuff happens. There's a
Absolutely.
big picture.
No, in fact, and this is, how we choose our candidates is obviously a pillar of our democracy. And so basically I would summarize it as this in terms of how we nominate, how we select candidates to run for president. Basically, over time, there's been a struggle over how open or how closed the process is. In other words, do you keep the group of people who make the decision, do you keep that small and sort of, is it insiders and just party people, and then you exclude most of the public? Or do you open it up?
And in theory, experts.
Exactly. Experts or the equivalent of experts, the political equivalent. Do you leave it to that small elite group? Right. Or do you open it up to rank and file voters? And over time, as we'll see, that has changed quite a bit. But at its core, even in recent decades, that's been sort of the struggle, right? Because the party insiders typically don't trust, quote unquote, the broader public to make the right decision in order to win elections, which is, of course, what parties exist to do.
Well, so then where do we begin? Let's begin. I'm going to take a wild stab that we should begin at the beginning.
We should begin at probably a good guess, certainly with the U.S. Constitution, which actually, as on so many other issues, is no help here. Just because, the Constitution is silent on the issue or the existence of political parties, as I'm sure most listeners know. And so, of course, it's also silent on the nomination process. In the first two elections, 1788 and 1792, partly because you had this massive consensus, not 100%, but darn close, that George Washington should be the president.
Yeah.
You really didn't have anything that we would recognize as a quote-unquote nomination process. Yeah. All of this was handled in the confines of the Electoral College, which we did a show on, I believe, as well, back in the day. But so, those first two elections, there wasn't really a process.
Yeah, because and I think the overwhelming consensus was, in fact, George Washington should be the first president.
Absolutely.
But of course, Washington very famously says, I'm not going to serve more than 2 terms. So things change. And so we have 1788, 1792. So by 1796, Washington says, nope, 2 terms is enough. We don't want a king.
That's right. I was going to say, and sets what a lot of people interpreted as a precedent.
Yeah. So that's the big change. 1796 is the big change.
Right. And so that's the beginning of sort of the first. That marks, in retrospect, certainly the beginning of the first so-called era. I'm going to talk about 4 different eras when it comes to the presidential nomination process.
Yeah, historians we're big on creating eras. The first
we're
party
big
period,
on
the second party
periodization.
Period,
That's what that's our life's blood. How do you slice and dice this period of time?
Yeah,
the periodization.
We get paid by the period.
We get paid by the period. So 1796 to 1832, give or take, is called the Congressional Caucus era. And so what happens in this period is basically either the congressional party has a caucus or a state legislature has a party caucus, and these choose the candidates. So, and this is where you start to see the word caucus, as far as I understand, used sort of in this context in a sort of a widespread way. Up until 1820, the Democratic Republican Party, which is intended to confuse, certainly for historians, it's today's Democratic Party. The Democratic Republican Party, it's the party of Jefferson and the party of Jackson. Up until 1820, the members of that party in Congress would pick a single candidate. So they would caucus and pick a candidate, and that's how you ended up with a particular presidential candidate.
Now, at this stage, is the other party still the Federalist Party?
No. In fact, this is, by 1820, the Federalists have imploded, and you have this so-called era of good feelings, which I think we talked about in another show. This is the era of good feelings, i.e. everyone gets along because there's only one party. Yeah, the Whigs don't really emerge until the late 1820s, I believe. So, yeah, we're in this transitional period. But the second era begins in 1832. This is known as the Caucus and National Convention era. So this will sound a little more familiar. This is when, for the first time, one by one, the parties start to embrace the idea of a national convention.
Right,
and the first party, I love this, the first party to actually have a national convention was the Anti-Masonic Party. Yeah, yes, there was. I wonder if it could think of it as the QAnon of its day. This is the party that's directed against Freemasons. 1831.
Well, maybe we should tell people, because we have so many young listeners for whom Masonic means nothing.
Freemasons.
Why did you have to be anti-Mason?
Yeah, Freemasons. By the way, well into the 20th century, they are the subject of some of the biggest conspiracy theories out there, including in the United States. That this was this secret fraternity that basically dominated the world, and we need to do something about it. And the feeling was so strong, they actually formed a political party, the Anti-Masonic Party.
Yeah, Masonry is a sort of organization, and you join, and it's secret.
Exactly,
and blah,
correct.
Blah, blah, blah.
And
it's usually prominent businessmen.
Yes, and political leaders,
professionals.
I'm pretty sure some of the founding fathers were Freemasons, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So, Anti-Masonic Party, they stand out because in 1831 they had the first national convention. And keep in mind here, like, why would they do this? Well, they don't have any congressmen. They haven't. So you could, by definition, you could not have a congressional caucus, right? Their congressmen couldn't meet to select the candidate.
Yeah.
So they had to come up with something else. So they had a national convention. So basically how the national convention works is, and it's pretty much the same now, as far as I understand, is that district conventions would choose delegates to a state convention, and the state convention would choose delegates to a national convention. And then they would all meet at a single national convention, right? One event in one place where people have sort of percolated up, and then it nominates a candidate.
Well, that sounds democratic. I mean, it's starting at the local level. People are deciding, then it keeps going up the hierarchy.
Exactly. And it's sort of representative in its structure, no question. The problem is where the rubber meets the road is that this really wasn't all that democratic because, as people might guess, caucuses and conventions were usually heavily influenced, if not outright dominated, by party bosses, right? Even at the lowest level, your place in the party, your influence, your role depends on you towing the line with the local party boss. And then that also replicates itself at the higher levels as well. And so the party bosses end up pretty soon, in most cases, controlling delegates. And then we get into the whole question of the so-called smoke-filled room, right? Where the decision about who the nominee is actually determined by a very small number of very powerful people.
This is back in the days when all men used to smoke. And
yes, exactly. Right, that's what it refers to. Yeah, and I think we talked about it when we talked about Warren G. Harding. That the 1920 election, that was the claim. It turns out it's not true, but that was the claim, that it was these men hanging out in a smoke-filled room who basically picked Warren G. Harding as the nominee. But I mean, the truth remains that it was overall a pretty opaque and authoritarian process, and this lasted until 1912.
Wow, that's 80 years.
80 years, yeah. So throughout the 19th century, so 1832 to 1912.
Why then do things change in 1912?
Well, as listeners may recognize that date, this is sort of the peak of the influence of progressivism at the national level. I always like to point this out. In 1912, you had that presidential election, you had Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and also Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate. The three of them essentially got 3/4 of the votes for president, and they're all progressive candidates.
Yeah, that's right. And
so,
we're open about it, openly progressive.
Yeah. Or to the left, right? If you're Eugene Debs, who got almost 1 million votes. I mean, even though he's an avowed socialist. So it's sort of the peak of national progressivism. And a pillar of progressivism was basically opposition at the grassroots to boss rule. In other words, a sense that our democracy had been hijacked by party bosses. And that's in other words, our political system at all levels was not responsive anymore. And this then leads to what you and I know as a presidential primary at the state level.
Okay, so this is intended to get rid of the smoke-filled room.
Or at least weaken their power, right?
Okay.
To put the nomination process in the hands of rank and file voters, not just party members, not just party apparatchiks, and certainly not party bosses. So this is the part of the third era, which has been called the mixed primary and caucus era.
Wow.
Which is to say you have primaries, but they are not really determining as they are in our period. So Florida is the first state to have a presidential primary, and that's in 1901. But for most of this era, so from 1912 up until 1968, as we'll see, for most of this era, only 12 states had primaries. I was surprised to learn this. So it doesn't really catch on, not in most states. There were a few more at first and then dropped down to 12, and there were 12 for a long, long time. Now, they're not irrelevant. These primaries could be bellwethers. So in other words, you might have, I know this happened, for example, in 1944, I believe. You had a Wisconsin primary in the Republican Party, and that led some people to drop out and helped assure Tom Dewey's nomination when you actually went to the convention.
Yeah.
So they could be bellwethers. They could lead candidates to stay in or to drop out, but still the decision to pick a particular person was done in conventions. You had a single meeting in a single city, and these were often hotly contested. Maybe we could do a show about this. I mentioned another show, the Democratic National Convention in 1924. They took 103 ballots to pick a candidate.
Oh, lordy.
Yeah, which is like way off the charts. But there were others that went maybe not that far, but it took maybe 5, 6. I don't know, there was one that took 9 ballots. And you have another ballot, and then some votes shift, and you have all this deal making, et cetera, et cetera. But still, until 1968, it was a convention that actually picked the nomination. Somebody might win on the first ballot. Like, I think Eisenhower in 52. I think he won on the first ballot.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could go into a convention thinking, oh, this is all, so-and-so has this all locked up. But still, it's the convention that decides. It's the actual vote of the delegates in the hall who decide who the nominee is. And you might go in not knowing who that is.
Well, Professor, I remember reading, back when I was an undergrad, that one of the reasons Kennedy was able to win the 1960 Democratic nomination was that he actually paid attention to the primaries and said, if I win enough primaries, I'll go in with so many delegates that I'll be much stronger at the convention than ever before, and they can't take it away from me. In other words, 1960 may be,
right,
at least for the Democrats, the first time that the primaries matter a lot more than they did.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, and I think you're right. Certainly compared to like 56 or 52, in 60 is a case where primaries seem to matter more. And once again, partly in the sense of what I said earlier, which is as a bellwether, right? It shows your strength. If Kennedy can win a primary in West Virginia, for example, which he did, that can indicate your strength more broadly, and then might be sort of a bellwether or sort of a brushback pitch against other candidates. And then your fundraising gets stronger and their fundraising gets weaker, right? In other words, you start a trend basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that over this period, in some ways, even though the primaries are few in number, they are slowly gaining influence in the larger picture. But still, I mean, when you're going into the Los Angeles convention in 1960 for the Democrats, it was still up in the air who was actually going to be the nominee for sure.
Yeah, so technically still the convention picks the nominee. But then, as you said, the end of this period is 1968. And 1968, frankly, has so many parallels to what's going on now. It's astounding. We've done a show on this, and I encourage Buzzkillers to go back and listen to it, but let's keep Carl Seiler's questions in mind here. Why is 1968 important for the primary versus convention question?
Right. So it's my understanding that, as you've alluded to, 1968 was an unbelievable year. There's so much going on, including chaos in Chicago, where the Democrats held their convention, right? This is where you had a police riot, you had mayhem in the streets, you had all sorts of violence and arrests. You had the yippies showing up, trying to elect a pig president of the United States. You had a lot going on. And for our purposes, what's important is that the Democratic National Convention in August of 1968 chose Vice President Hubert Humphrey as the candidate, even though he had not won a single primary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for a lot of Democratic activists, the rank and file, a lot of the sort of constituent groups that make up the Democratic base, for a lot of them, this was the last straw.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. This seemed like to be the worst sort of old school party boss politics, right? Like to the extent that we involved everyone, all that was just shunted aside, and sort of the machine candidate, the one candidate who, for example, LBJ approved of,
who was also vice
the
president.
Yeah, and was vice president. He's the one who gets the nod. So a lot of people thought this smelled to high heaven. And so what happens afterwards, and of course the Democrats narrowly lose in November to Nixon. But what happens after that, the Democrats put together a commission, either chaired or co-chaired by George McGovern, which recommends changes. And this leads, and not only Democrats, the Republicans soon follow suit. This leads to the gradual widespread adoption of binding state primaries and caucuses to choose pledged delegates. In other words, you have a vote, everyday voters, and of course the rules vary a lot from state to state. Whether you have a primary or caucus, can anyone vote, only registered Democrats, et cetera, et cetera. Those rules will vary quite a bit and change over time. But basically, delegates are apportioned on the basis of that election in a particular state, and those delegates go to the convention and they have to vote for the person they were voted in to vote for, basically.
Right. Wow.
And so this ushers in, as of 1972, the fourth and, as far as we know, final era. Could always change.
By the way,
this is the one we're in now.
Ka-ching,
this
ka-ching,
is known as
the ka-ching, ka-ching era. We know this is how historians make our money, by defining
Absolutely.
eras.
Exactly.
So,
now we're going to get paid. So 1972 until now, we have what's called the National Binding Primary era, where primaries are supreme. Mm-hmm. And conventions essentially become coronations. That you go into a convention knowing who has all the delegates locked up, and then it basically becomes, a 3 or 4 day jamboree and a way to advertise the party through free television.
Right.
And I've seen people argue, and I agree, that the network should stop carrying the conventions. And I think also they have dialed back their coverage because there's no drama. There's no decision-making importance in this meeting.
They don't even really debate a party platform anymore.
I mean, or they do, but not in the convention. And
Right,
it's something you could easily do via Zoom or email. Yeah, I know that the Republicans famously in 2020 just jettisoned the idea of a platform altogether.
Yeah,
which, of course, among other things, reflects their complete capture by Donald Trump.
Well, but I like the idea of people saying, hey, this platform meeting could have been an email. There's a meme in that somewhere.
For sure, like everything else in human existence. But yeah, so the conventions after 1972 really have no role in choosing party nominees.
They're just coronations.
They're coronations. They're just making it official.
But Professor, this kind of brings me back to your original point, because now, in theory, everything's gone back to the primaries where regular people are voting. So voila, democracy. Regular people are voting for candidates, and those candidates are getting as many delegates as they can. So am I right about that? Voila, democracy.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the earlier eras, I would say absolutely yes. Now, as everyone knows, our democracy is flawed in 100 different ways, including in our primary process, like among other things, the all-importance of Iowa and New Hampshire and how problematic that is.
Because they're early.
But because they're early, absolutely. But I would say mostly yes. Both parties do a couple of things to sort of keep one thumb on the scale when it comes to who has power. Is it the party or the people? So, for example, the Republican Party still has 3 at-large delegates from each state and territory, so they are not pledged to any particular candidate going into the convention. They're a minority, but that's part of the old school. The Democrats have 15% of their delegates are so-called superdelegates.
Yep.
Which is a term people may have heard. This was basically an attempt to claw back some power from the rank and file. But I'll also point out, as far as I know, in 2016, an effort led by people like Bernie Sanders, there was a rule change which said that superdelegates are obligated to match their state's primary results.
Right.
So, I mean, what I just described is basically in microcosm of this bigger struggle, right? Once you open it up to primaries, you're always going to have party insiders who say, we're going to get creamed because the people who vote may not pick the candidate who has the best chance of winning.
Right.
We party experts and activists and, officials of the party, we know better. So
Yeah.
we need to have more influence in this decision. And I don't think that struggle is going to go anywhere. That's always going to be there.
And in some ways, the people who have that influence might eventually just become all the media people, but that's another whole nother
Correct.
show. So we're at a stage where the primaries rule, and therefore really are conventions meaningless?
For the most part, yes.
Hmm.
And I was just, I don't know if you noticed this just in these last few days, because what was it, last week, the Republicans had their convention in Milwaukee. And I'm thinking, even compared to 2024 and 2016, I haven't noticed that much discussion of the impact or lack of impact of that convention.
Yeah.
For example, maybe you have. I haven't seen any discussion of like, oh, did Trump get a bounce out of this convention? Because that always used to be the frame, right?
Yeah.
Did this candidate do themselves any favors, or did they hurt themselves at the convention? A lot of people said that Trump's speech wasn't any good, but there's no discussion of, did he get a bounce out of this or not? And if that's true, maybe we're moving toward even greater irrelevance for the conventions.
Yeah. Now, maybe in this case, it's a unique situation because Trump...
That's a one-off.
Well, because Trump might have gotten a bounce from the assassination attempt, but not from the convention.
Right.
But
you might not be able to isolate the variables.
But I believe they're right, though. I do think he didn't get a convention bounce. So I think this may be exactly where we're going.
Right. Well, and my point is that it seems like people have lost interest in whether he got a bounce. Right? So what I'm saying?
That's right.
In other words,
yeah.
Right. And that would suggest that maybe without noticing, we're slowly deciding, boy, these conventions, they really don't matter one way or the other. Now, of course, with the obvious caveat that with the Democrats, it seems like the latest news is everyone is very quickly rushing to basically express their support for Kamala Harris. And she already has, according to the news, has enough delegates locked up.
Yeah.
Delegates who have gone on the record, yes, I'm going to vote for her, in which case this will become another coronation. But if she hadn't, and if Joe Biden, for example, hadn't endorsed her, and if people like Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi had said, well, we need to have an open convention so the delegates can choose, we might have gone back to 1924, right? Or at least back to the earlier era where the convention actually does decide, right? I mean, that was the structure and the rules. They're there for that.
Yeah.
Right.
But
so that could have happened.
The argument has always been in this last couple of weeks that an open convention looks like chaos and a party that isn't able to run its own house, keep its own house in order. So, and sorry, the fact that it's in Chicago again this year, just like the chaotic 1968 Chicago convention.
Yep.
Would be, well, at least the argument was that would be a death blow to the Democrats.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily share that argument. I mean, you could have an open convention that is maybe even tumultuous, but that ultimately selects a candidate.
Yeah.
And then within a couple of weeks, people have forgotten all that.
Especially with attention spans nowadays.
Exactly right. Yes, sir.
So then where does that put us with primaries? Are primaries only getting stronger?
I mean, I don't know if they're getting stronger, but I think they are here to stay for the foreseeable future when it comes to how we pick our candidates. I don't see them going away. There's going to be the continual jockeying for position, right? States changing their dates to increase their influence, right? There's going to be tinkering with it, but the basic reality of primaries and not conventions selecting candidates, I don't see that going anywhere.
Wow.
That would be way too. I mean, you might be some changes on the sly that sort of increase, for example, the power of superdelegates, that kind of thing. But it would be incremental. It wouldn't be fundamental.
Right. Well, once again, Professor, you have set us straight. We now understand these things much more, both in terms of what's going on now, but more importantly for this show, how we got to where we are now.
Right. Some of the background.
And so I'm very grateful that you were able to come on and do this show at the last minute. And Carl is very grateful, and other buzzkillers who've contacted me about this are very grateful. And so we're going to rush this into the audio editing room and try to get it out on Thursday. So Buzzkillers, after this one, we'll talk to you next week.